When I came across this story 2 years ago, I just thought it was kind of funny. When I went back to sort of revitalize it or restudy it for the YouTube channel, I just thought it was going to be something like that, funny, a little bit educational. Little did I know that it was going to unearth a thread that I would start tugging at that would eventually unravel a Marxist globalist plot to take over all of civilization through subterfuge, espionage,
chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Serious crap.
I know that as soon as I use the word Marxism, that's what I sound like I'm spinning some giant conspiracy theory. Really, what I am talking about, though, is I started digging into what I'm going to call infograph gate. What started as a hilarious story helped me understand the ideological underpinnings, from BLM to critical race theory, from identity politics to Marxism more broadly. So I'm going to ask you, stick around with me as I walk through my process of discovery and research, and I promise it's going to help you better understand and rightly respond to these ideas and movements that are shaping our age. So 2 years ago, the Smithsonian created this online portal to talk about whiteness and race issues in general, and they they published this infographic. Now, all the conservative podcasts and major social media platforms started roasting it instantaneously. It got memed to death. It got so bad that the Smithsonian had to not only take it down, but had to issue a non-apology apology. Now, while I was mildly amused at the time, I thought it was kind of funny. I did think there was probably more to this story. Basically, the headlines were so audacious that I thought there was literally no way that the Smithsonian, with all of its highly credentialed master's and doctoral degree level curators and directors, there's no way that any of these people would have actually put out an infographic that implied the things that people were saying it implied. It was said that it implied that people of color were dumber, less rational, that they were frequently late, that they couldn't speak correct grammar. It was basically every insidious trope or stereotype was all codified into one outrageous infographic. So I figured that there must have been some missing context. Potentially the conservatives were overblowing it, right? They were exaggerating the claims, or maybe it was as bad as they had said, but it was maybe published by a overzealous freshman who just got out of gender studies class or just binge watched every show on the Black Voices playlist on Netflix or Hulu or HBO Max or Amazon Prime. Maybe it was really atrocious, but it just hadn't been curated or it hadn't gone through all the steps of authentication or something. It was just an accident, basically. As I looked into it, it turned out I was the wrong one. One of the first articles I came across in my research was this one, and it was them saying that the Smithsonian had actually apologized. Now, when you look into it, that's actually not true. Apologies, as we all know, imply some form of guilt. I did something wrong, so therefore I'm sorry. They took no blame. Rather, they basically just blamed the public. Quote, "The whole idea behind the portal is how do we give tools to people to have these conversations that are vital to moving forward. This was one of those tools." Okay, so far, not taking anything back. "We have found it's not working the way we intended. We erred in including it." It's not working the way it intended. Now, the implication there being, because conservatives took this and ran with it, it wasn't actually helping, right? It wasn't helping their cause. They didn't say anything wrong. The infographic wasn't incorrect. Obviously it was. They didn't want to say any of that. Rather, they just said it wasn't helping move the conversation forward. As you continue through that article, what you find out is that this infographic was not cobbled together. It wasn't a bunch of random points. It was, as the interim director, Spencer Crew, described, the result of almost a decade of research. That infographic itself, the data in it, was derived from a book by Judy Katz written in 1978 called White Awareness, a Training Manual for Anti-Racists. These ideas have metastasized throughout all of culture to where the ideas that were cropping up and seeming radical back in the 70s and 80s, 90s are now mainstays in our cultural imagination. Now, we're going to go ahead and start by just looking at the infographic, have some fun, make fun of it, because it is truly evil. It is absolutely hilarious in the most dark way. Then we're going to kind of move through my progression of research and see what were the primary sources that this came from and the people that talk about it and propagate it. What are their underlining and underpinning ideas and philosophies that lead them to these truly abominable ideas? So to begin, as we move into the actual infographic, we're going to start by looking simply at the opening paragraph. This is the framing device for all the rest of it, so hang in there with me. It says this: white dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways that white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, here's where it gets real creepy. We have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color. Now, here's why people pay into this infographic. As you're going to see, the immediate implication of these ideas being born out of white culture implies that they are not also held by non-white culture, and they say just as much as that in the primary sources. That implication is profoundly insulting when you see the things that they attribute to white culture. Now, think about that as a framing device, okay? What they're trying to do is the things you're about to read about are typically discussed in terms of if they're true or if they're false, if they're good or bad. They want you to think of these as the products of white culture. They don't want you to think of these as something that is a part of the, say, moral order that maybe or maybe not whites have discovered. As you'll find out, very few of these things have anything to do with uniquely white culture. Most of these are involved in various different ways in many different cultures. As we go through this list, and here's where it gets genuinely hilarious in the dark way. If you're not a white person and you then look over these, they're trying to create a bracket in your mind so that you no longer think of these things, again, as true or false or good or bad, something that your culture holds or doesn't hold. Rather, they want you to think of it as this is an element of white culture that you have accidentally absorbed, and it is creating for you a false sense of value. This isn't really your value. This is the white man's value that you have accidentally absorbed. Let's go through some of the most insulting of them, because these are the funny ones. As you read each of these bullet points, you can say something like white culture is, or white culture produced, but then the opposite of that could also is the immediate logical implication. Non-white culture is not blank. So just pick your non-white culture. Black culture is not whatever. Indian culture is not whatever. So here we go. Probably the most insulting to me is the scientific section, that objective and rational thinking are products of white culture. The immediate implication being that Black, Asian, minority of choice culture is not as rational or linear thinking or scientific minded as white culture. I was listening to an old interview by Neil deGrasse Tyson, given by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was saying the exact opposite of this, that he feels one of his great reasons for doing what he does as an astrophysicist is simply to show that Black people can be just as scientifically minded and rational as anybody else, that rationality is not a white trait or a Black trait or whatever, it's a universal trait, and that science should be valued and venerated by all cultures. Yeah, that's obviously what we should all think about it, but that's not what they want you to think about it. They say white culture produces people who follow rigid time schedules, which I really think is a veiled way of saying that people of color are frequently late, which is also terrible and shouldn't be said. Pretty much the entire section on hard work and the Protestant work ethic seems to imply that people of color are lazier than white people. Again, not my idea, theirs. When they say that white culture breeds respect for authority, that's almost like akin to saying that people of color are naturally rebellious. When they say that white people work before they play or they delay gratification, this would imply that people of color have a hard time controlling their baser appetites and instincts, which is literally a racist idea forwarded in the 1800s to try to denigrate Black people as being less than whites, less human than whites. Whenever somebody tells a racist joke, they always start the exact same way, by looking over their shoulder, because they know that what they're about to say is profoundly insulting because it's rooted in denigrating stereotypes. And yet you can't accuse them of being genuinely malevolent because it's just a joke, right?
We're joking. We made the whole thing up, okay? We didn't mean it.
But if you were to take somebody who was sincere and they were to stand in front of you and they were to say something like, whites produce respect for authority, the rule of law and order, they're timely, they have a great command of the English language, and people of color don't. People of color are not timely, people of color don't respect authority, people of color are not rational, you would immediately assume I'm talking about somebody with deep-seated animosity towards people of color. And what you would not have guessed is that it's somebody who goes underneath the banner of anti-racist. And yet that's exactly what I'm telling you is going on here. Somehow the left has passed from simply the soft bigotry of low expectations to the hard bigotry of insulting stereotypes. Now, we're going to look at some other ones that are a little bit less obviously insulting. And I just want you to, they're just common values, and ask yourself, is anything about this uniquely white? And if it's not, why are they saying that it is? There's obviously an agenda being pushed here. And once you try to think it through, and then of course we're going to get to the primary sources here in a minute. Okay, so let's go back to the work, effort, and individualism. In the first section, it says that white culture values self-reliance, autonomy is rewarded. Is this in any way uniquely white or a product of white culture? Of course not. Every culture throughout all of time has valued people growing up into responsibility and into maturity, taking on more and more and more of their own responsibility and taking care of those who are in their ward. Now, of course, rugged individualism can be taken way too far. You can get to a hyper-individualistic state where you consider yourself utterly unreliant on anybody else, and then we all have to start homesteading or something, which is great if you do that. But obviously, that's not the way most civilization works. It's not the way white civilization has ever really worked. It says white culture believes that you are in control of your environment. And of course, in a limited sense, that's obviously true. But it's also so vague that it could mean a whole host of contradictory ideas. So they're not giving you enough precision here to actually weigh whether what they're saying is uniquely white or good or bad. How about the white ideal that you get what you deserve? First off, that's more of like a proverb or a goal that we're supposed to be attaining towards, right? Not this idea that whites think that everybody does get what they deserve, that every single time you work hard, you're always going to make more money, and that every single time that you do something bad, you'll be rightly punished. Of course, nobody thinks that. That's just what we want to happen, but that's probably true of all societies. We want the bad guys punished. We want the good guys rewarded. This is a major recurring theme throughout most philosophies and most countries and most continents. I can't possibly see how this is uniquely white. Of course, there's no one-for-one parallel between exactly how hard you work and the exact result you achieve. But I think Thomas Sowell puts it pretty darn well like this.
If you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't.
That leads right into the very next idea of whiteness, is that hard work is the key to success. First off, let's just look at that logically, and that's basically a tautology, like red is red, hard work equals success, or is necessary for success. Of course it is. Why? Because the trappings of success, right? If you want to say it's money or wealth or fame, you achieve your dreams or your goals, you have property, whatever success is, if you don't have it because of hard work, then it's not success. That's what we call providence or luck or happenstance or grace, right? Or privilege. But if you attained it by hard work, that's when we call it success. And again, is this in any sense a distinctly white idea? David Goggins really famously lost 106 pounds at the age, I think, of 18 to get into the Navy. He literally calculated out the number of calories in every pound of fat, and then calculated out the number of pounds he had to lose to get into the Navy, and the amount of time that he had to do it in. And he just worked out and ate so carefully as to burn exactly that throughout the entire 3 months. He did this and has then spun himself up into a massive celebrity on the simple message of working insanely hard. James Brown was one of the most celebrated musicians of the last 100 years. He gained the moniker as the hardest working man in show business because of the insane hours he would put his team through, because of the exact precision that he insisted that they brought to every single performance. Now imagine looking at those guys in the eye and saying something like, what you discovered in hard work is not actually a universal value that applies to all people at all times. No, what actually happened was you internalized a white value and a white precept in a white supremacy system. Okay. And because of that, you gained access to whiteness by acting white. So you weren't really authentically black, or your actions are in some sense tainted, and you're acting too white. Now, that would be insane. That would be insulting. It would be wrong of you to say something like that. And yet, here it is in print. How about this idea about the nuclear family being uniquely white, having a father in the home, having a mother in the home, having 2.3 children. I recently looked it up. It'll be on the screen. I can't remember the exact numbers, but Asians are actually outperforming whites when it comes to these numbers, and whites are right in the middle of the pack. Black families have pretty similar numbers, and every society has always valued intact families. Now, first off, nobody ever says 2.3 kids, but sure, maybe there's some cultural pressure in white society to have around 2 kids to 3 kids, not too many more. That would also be true of every other culture then that has about that birth rate, which is true of every culture in America. Currently, Asian and Pacific Islanders have kids in marriage at almost twice the rate of white families. Are they acting more white than white people? Have they internalized more white culture than white people have? And the white birth rate is right about the average. Everybody's in the 2 point somethings. So no, it's not that wildly different. It's not uniquely white. There's obviously an agenda here. The idea that white cultures are uniquely patriarchal, as you say, see what they say there about the father being the head of the house, that is even close to true. Basically, every single major civilization has been patriarchal for most of recorded history. There are a few outliers, but even still, even in those, it's not quite the matriarchal societies that we see are not just the inverse of the patriarchy. They're a little more complicated. Now, the American family has continued to break down and degrade over the last several decades to the point that 40%, almost half of all children born today are born out of wedlock. Now, this trend has gone across all the ethnicities, but at differential rates. The hardest hit is the black family, with over 70% of black children born in out of wedlock homes, meaning they almost certainly won't have a father in the home. Sometimes it's a mother, but usually it's the father who's absent. And real quick, before you blame this on Jim Crow or other forms of systemic oppression, this all occurred after the civil rights era and after the ending of Jim Crow, not before. So to repeat, this trend has affected all ethnicities in America. Now, what I just said there about the degradation and the breakdown of the American family, according to this infographic, I would not be assessing a genuine social pathology that is occurring more and more and more rapidly among all the ethnicities. Rather, what I'm simply doing, according to this infographic, is assessing every other culture based on white social construction, based on what white people have just sort of created and invented and assumed to be true. But really, that's just because we have centered our whiteness. Now, again, you can always go back and find millions of people who are not white who hold to these very same values. Here's a great clip of Barack Obama talking about the importance of family in the stability of socialization and the stability of society and the ending and the decrease in violent crime.
There's no more important ingredient for success. Nothing that would be more important for us reducing violence than strong, stable families. Which means we should do more to promote marriage and encourage fatherhood. Don't get me wrong, as the son of a single mom who gave everything she had to raise me with the help of my grandparents, I turned out okay. But I think it's, so we got single moms out here, they're heroic what they're doing, and we are so proud of them. But at the same time, I wish I'd had a father who was around and involved.
So obviously the value of the nuclear family is not a white thing. That's just a silly idea to posit. So moving past the infographic, I decided to sort of dig into this idea of white awareness and whiteness to be studied as a topic all to its own. And whenever you look up and you kind of go down that rabbit trail, one of the things you find over and over and over again is that those who talk about whiteness almost always couple it with this idea of decentering whiteness. Now, what is that Orwellian term? I think it's important for us to know. I think a lot of the anti-woke out there will hear something like decenter whiteness. You catch the obvious racism implied in that, and then you just sort of go, oh, well, yeah, then it's wrong. I think it's important for us to try to go a little bit deeper, understand what they actually mean by that. That took me to a guy named Jeff Hitchcock. He's about as close to an expert on whiteness as I think you can find. Let me read out to you his credentials. He's the co-founder of the Center for the Study of White American Culture Incorporated. He's a founding member of the New Jersey chapter of the Anti-Racist Alliance, and he has presented on and written professionally on Decentering Whiteness. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's try to get the idea from him. What is whiteness and what does it mean to decenter it? He opens up his 2015 edition of Decentering Whiteness, the article, by saying this: whiteness in its contemporary form in the United States, society, is culturally based. But that doesn't tell you what it is. It just tells you that it's based in culture. It controls institutions which are extensions of white American culture. So whiteness controls these institutions, but what is it that is controlling them? We haven't defined it yet. Which are also bounded, that is governed by the values and the precepts of white American culture. Now, the first thing that we have to just say outright is that when it comes to social justice dialogue, linguistic precision is almost always lacking and even sometimes denigrated. And because of that, you end up getting words intermixed. So and conflated. So for the Smithsonian, they said that whiteness is the same thing as the culture and the value and the precepts of white people. Whereas for Jeff, he's going to say, Mr. Hitchcock, I should say, he's going to say, rather, it's actually something more like white people being in control in positions of authority, and that it's those ideas and precepts that are supporting it. That's going to come up really important here in a minute. That distinction, I'll repeat it, so don't feel like you have to rewind. So for him, he says this: a quick glance at the top of our central or mainstream culture in the United States confirms it is still very white and male. Dominance by men has long characterized white society, as well as all other society. Our presidency, until recently, was all white and male. The United States Senate is virtually all white and all male. Fortune 500 CEOs are virtually all white and all male. I hope you see what's happening here. He is simply assuming that because a certain majority of these really important decision-making positions are historically and consistently dominated by white men, that therefore that means that white men are supreme or the system is rigged in their favor. And yet what he doesn't recognize is that it's not producing results that are in concert with that. What I mean by that is that when you look at things like median income, when you look at things like home ownership, degrees earned, fill in the blank, what you find out is that white people, while they may be consistently occupying the upper echelons of decision making, this isn't producing white people at the top of all these other metrics. They're actually right in the very middle of the pack. It's the assumption that having somebody of the right skin color at the right position will automatically mean flourishing for that subgroup. That's a foolish assumption. It's never defended. It's just assumed. Now, he pulls really heavily from the work of Katz, who is the progenitor of that infographic. And he defines something being centered as being normal, standard, obvious, common sense, morally correct, maybe even ordained by God. And he says it like this, quote, when we talk about being in the center of society, by that we mean having, listen to these, this is going to start getting kind of scary pretty quick. He says, we mean having access to power, control of resources, and the ability to enforce one's values. Okay? Now, he does not call, notice here, when we talk about decentering whiteness, he does not call for the decentralization of power. That's essential. He's saying whiteness is centralized, and when we need to decenter it, he's not going to say we need to therefore get the control of all these resources out of the hands. We need to diffuse the instruments of power. No. Rather, he's just going to call for other people to be at the wheel of the ship. He says the center can also be oppressive or supportive in the history of the United States. Whiteness as the center has always, on the whole, been oppressive. So white people, when we're in top, when we're somehow in control of all of these things because we have the presidency and because a white guy has always been president and we don't have the presidency, because a white guy was always president and because a white guy is more likely to be a CEO, therefore we as a class control all of these axes and tools and levers of power. We have used that to oppress people. Now, I don't in any sense mean to detract from the times when America itself has been horribly and truly despicably oppressive to people, especially black people. But you need to understand, he's not simply saying that white people have done terrible things. He's saying the values and the precepts that undergird white culture are always oppressive. So it's not simply that Jim Crow was oppressive. It's not that slavery was oppressive. Of course they were. It goes so much far beyond that. It's the idea that hard work will result in more success. That's oppressive. The idea of being timely. That's oppressive. The idea that we should all use correct grammar in our communication. That is oppressive. The idea that the family unit should be between a man and a woman and they should be married and that they should stick together for children. That is oppressive according to this viewpoint. So then, of course, since whiteness is centered, how do we remedy this? He says we need to take whiteness out of the center and replace the center with multiracial values. In another place, he says it more succinctly. Whiteness needs to be taken out of the center to join the other racial, cultural groups on the margins. He is not wanting us to take white out of the center and then replace it with black cultural values or Indian cultural values. No. Rather, we have a non-hierarchical system where everybody's on the margins. There is no center, and whatever the center is, it is the center of allowing everybody else to be at the margins. It is the idea that that there's no hierarchy of culture, but that all culture, we have what we call cultural equity, and that all cultures have equal access, and therefore the only way to measure that is by equal outcomes, which is starting to sound a whole lot like Marxism. But how? So he tries to answer, how can we decenter whiteness? And he comes at it by critiquing this idea of individual cultures trying to attack whiteness. He says, cultures of color, however, are not likely to unilaterally displace whiteness for many years at the soonest. In effect, with people of color acting unilaterally, the model is more like one of surrounding whiteness. This may diminish the scope of white culture, but it still leaves it at the center. It will take a multi-racial effort to displace whiteness, one that includes people from all racial and cultural groups. The idea of identifying whiteness, the whole reason why that infographic exists, now being pushed by the most influential and prestigious museum authority in the or institute in the nation, is this at the very root of this idea of naming whiteness, collecting a set of what is whiteness. It's so that we can mark it as such, and we can actively work through a multiracial conglomerate movement to shift this idea of white culture out of the center and off to the periphery, so that now all cultures can enjoy equal access to the levers of power. And that's measured by equal distribution of 13% of the population is black, so 13% of CEOs should be black. And 6% of the population, I'm making this number up, 6% of the population is Asian, so we need 6% of senators to be Asian. That's how they measure. Now, again, that's sounding a whole lot like, you guessed it, communism. So let me tie a few of these threads together, because I know it's a lot of ideas. Let me tie them together with a series of questions and answers. With this vision of society, we have an elite group that is at the top of all of our power centers. What is that group? Whites. Who is not in the center? Who's at the bottom or pushed out to the margins? Non-whites. How did we get here? Because whites oppressed everybody. What was the means of that oppression? Cultural capital. How does this supremacy persist and propagate itself? Through white supremacy or white ideology or whiteness. White people have access to those values and behaviors, and because those are the ones that are rewarded by society, they get ahead. Other cultures aren't valued by society, therefore they can't get ahead. What is the goal of this vision of society? It is to reorient it and to decenter whiteness, to abolish white supremacy, and to create an equitable society in which all cultures achieve the exact same outcomes. And if you have studied Marxism even a little bit, every red bell just went off. That literally hit every single major idea of Marxism. Now, that does not mean that it's wrong. I haven't critiqued Marxism yet, but I want you to understand that in the literature, in their own words, they are perfectly comfortable with this title. But I think a lot of people are so afraid of Marxism because of the Red Scare and fill in the blank. They think that you are automatically dismissing their ideas because they're Marxists. That's not true. We will dismiss their ideas, but not because they're Marxist, but because Marxist ideas are bad. And I'm going to get to that here in a minute. Now, for those who are genuinely unfamiliar with Marxism, and all you know of communism is that it's this idea that everybody should kind of have the same stuff, and somehow we kind of take care of the poor by taking from the rich and giving to everybody, and we all have identical amounts of property. That's not really the essence of Marxism. That's just hopefully the end goal of Marxism. But we need to get to the actual philosophy. This guy was an intelligent, I would say even a brilliant man. I think he was profoundly wrong, but he was a brilliant man who created a really inventive and creative way of thinking about the world. And it was not entirely internally coherent, but it was largely internally coherent. And you need to understand those ideas in order to actually critique it. So what I'll do is I will explain a piece of Marxism, and then the exact parallel will be seen through whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it critical race theory, which essentially is what it is, or if you want to call it whiteness studies, or if you want to call it social justice, all of these are monikers for the same sets of basic ideas. So the first and initial idea to understand Marxism literally is the opening line to the first chapter of the first section of the 3-section book, The Communist Manifesto. And he opens it by saying this: all of human civilization can be boiled down to basically class struggle, and that class struggle can be summarized as this: oppressor versus oppressed. It's never equal parties. It's always this asymmetrical class antagonism, the oppressors versus the oppressed. Now for Marx, the oppressors he called them the bourgeoisie, and the bottom were called the proletariats. These were the capitalists, these were the workers. What is the corollary to that in critical race theory or social justice? Well, they have exactly that same reductionistic view of society, that it can all be described by power structures and dichotomies and hierarchy between the haves and the have-nots, or the tops and the bottoms, or the centered and the marginalized. And when we bifurcate it, according to critical race theory, it's no longer the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, rather it's the whites versus the non-whites. Now, how were they able to oppress in Marxism? The capitalists had access to this special kind of private property called capital, and they use this capital to oppress the proletariat. In critical race theory, how does this oppression take place? It takes place through what they call whiteness or race. Let me quote here from the Brandeis University website on their Our Social Justice definitions. And here's how they define race. Race is a misleading and deceptively appealing classification of human beings created by who? By white people, originally from Europe, which assign human worth and social status using the white racial identity as the archetype of humanity for the purpose of creating and maintaining privilege. I'm Jewish, but my skin color puts me in proximity to white people, that we apparently, white people, created this idea, this classification of people based on their skin color. And we did this, why? For a very specific purpose, for the purpose of creating and maintaining privilege, power, and systems of oppression. So we create this false classification of race in order to create the dichotomy in which white people can keep themselves at the top. Now, going back to Marxism, why was it that only the bourgeoisie had capital, had this type of private property that accessed them, that gave them access to more and more and more wealth? And why did the proletariat not have it? Well, the bourgeoisie had to come up with some way of explaining and justifying their existence and their oppression. Otherwise, they would start to feel bad. The people at the bottom would realize that they're being oppressed. So they create ideology. All right. And this ideology, which was what he called capitalism, was an overarching philosophy that trained the minds of the proletariat to be oppressed, and it trained the minds of the oppressors to feel justified in their oppression. You're not really oppressing them, you're offering them freedom, and it just happens to shake out this way. This led the Hungarian Marxist Lukács, I think I said it right, and I'm not even going to try to say his last name, or his first name. He coined the title, or this idea, of having false consciousness, which is the idea that the proletariat have so internalized, there's that word, the ideology of the people at the top, that it has convinced them that they actually deserve to be oppressed. Now, they wouldn't think of it as oppression. They would just deserve to be at the bottom. They deserve to be workers. And the capitalists have assuaged their guilt by justifying their actions through this ideology. This is why Marx talked about religion being the opium of the masses, because it eases the pain of being oppressed, and it shifts your gaze off into eternity, so you're not able to see the conditions you're actually in. This makes you useless for the cause. So what's the solution here? Well, we have to throw away these old ideas. We have to throw away the ideology. We have to throw away the religion and help you raise your consciousness and become totally aware of your oppression. Now, let's take this over to the critical race or the social justice theory. What takes the place of capitalism or the ideology? Well, it's whiteness or white supremacy or white cultural values. It's the idea that hard work will help you succeed in life. Well, these sorts of ideas, timeliness and correct grammar, yada, 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 these are actually forms of oppression. Black people and people of color and Indians and Asians don't have access to them. Now, again, I'm trying to present this without critique. I think everybody listening goes, but Black people and Asians and Indians can all speak correct English and can work really hard and can, right, I'm not trying to critique it yet. We'll get to that here in a minute. So try not to pull out your hair just yet. So white people have access to these cultural values and whatever else. And because no one else does, that's why they're being oppressed. That's what's keeping them from flourishing in our society. So if you're a Black man or an Asian man or an Indian man who does believe as, say, Kevin Hart or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or any of the guys I already mentioned or Morgan Freeman.
Do you think that race plays a part in wealth distribution or either a mindset that you can't
Today?
or cannot? Yeah.
No,
You don't?
no, I don't. Hey, you and I, we're proof. Why would race have anything to do with it? Put your mind to what you want to do and go for that. It's kind of like religion to me. It's a good excuse for not getting there.
So if you're a Black man or an Indian man or an Asian man who thinks that you're not oppressed, who feels as though the system is basically working and that with hard work and determination and a little bit of luck and a little bit of providence from God, that you can make something of your life and that you aren't consigned to absolute squalor and poverty. If you believe that, then you have been given into false consciousness. You don't recognize your own oppression and you're useless for the cause. That's why you have the famous senator, member of the squad, Ayanna Pressley, saying, we don't need more Black faces that don't want to be Black voices. Because if you're a Black face who says, you're a Black guy, who says that I think with hard work and determination and fill in the blank, that you can get ahead in life, you are propagating white supremacy. That's why the LA Times can run an article saying that Larry Elder, who's a libertarian, is the Black face of white supremacy. They're not just being insulting. This is a part of their ideology, that white supremacy is not just a bunch of guys with hoods on their heads. Rather, white supremacy is the system itself that rewards white values, white behaviors. So when he comes along and says the system basically works, there's ways to fix the system, that really what needs to be done is we need to fix our schools and we need to work hard and we need to fix our families. When he comes along and says something like that, then he is just feeding into the ideology that they think is oppressing people of color. And the solution, of course, is this idea of consciousness awakening. For the Marxists, they would say we need to raise the consciousness of the proletariat. And this was literally the quote from Marx is that the immediate aim of communism is the same of that of all other proletariat parties, the immediate formation of the proletariat into a class. You want to unite all of the proletariat into one class, so then you have a united force to push back against the bourgeoisie, to push away bourgeois supremacy. Literally, the second thing he says, to unite the proletariat into a class, and then the abolition of bourgeois supremacy. Well, how can we relate that to critical race theory? Relatively easily, right? Go back to Mr. Hitchcock. He says that we need not to have just Black people critiquing white culture and Indian people critiquing white culture. No. We need a multiracial conglomerate. We need an intersectional approach in which all people who have been marginalized and oppressed unite together into one class, proletariat class, and they work to overthrow not bourgeois supremacy, but white supremacy. Now, I know I ran through this super fast. If you think that I'm still wearing a tinfoil hat, that I'm making this up, that I'm seeing connections where they aren't any, I just need to emphasize, I've said this a few times, This comes directly from the primary sources. So I'm going to read to a quote by an interview of Richard Delgado, who is one of the founding members of critical race theory. And he's going to describe the event where all of these critical legal studies scholars got together. And you're going to hear him describe themselves as Marxists. I just want to whet your palate for that. So listen for that coming up. Now, I do know that this is a longer quote. Bear with me because I think it's important just to make sure that I'm not pulling somebody out of context. It's not half a sentence or one sentence. I'm giving you a nice little picture of this founding meeting and how he describes it. I was a member of the founding conference. 24 of us gathered in Madison, Wisconsin to see what we had in common and whether we could plan a joint action in the future, whether we had a scholarly agenda we could share, and perhaps a name for the organization. I had taught at the University of Wisconsin, and Kim Crenshaw later joined the faculty as well. The school, by the way, Kim Crenshaw is the namer of critical race theory. The school seemed a logical site for it because of the Institute for Legal Studies that David Trubeck was running at the time and because of the Hasty Fellowship program. The school was a center for left academic legal thought, so we gathered at the convent, that was where the happening meeting was, a convent, for 2.5 days and around a table in an austere room with stained glass windows and crucifixes here and there, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists. I'm going to keep reading this quote, but I just want to highlight here, when he says this, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists, there is nowhere in the academic literature that you read about critical race theory that doesn't connect it back to Marxism. This is not meant to be a scare tactic. It's just simply to say, if you have a good reason to doubt the reductionistic view of society as oppressor versus oppressed, then you also have a good reason to doubt critical race theory. If you have a good reason to doubt or to reject this idea of thinking in terms of class consciousness, then you also have a good reason to doubt the idea of thinking in terms of race consciousness. All right, continuing. It was an odd place for a bunch of Marxists, says one of the founding members of critical race theory, and worked out a set of principles. Then we went on our separate ways. Most of us who were there have gone on to become prominent critical race theorists, including Kim Crenshaw, who spoke at the Iowa conference, as well as Mani Matsuda and Charles Lawrence. Who were both here in spirit. Derek Bell, who was doing critical race theory long before it had a name, was in the Madison workshop, and also has been something of an intellectual godfather for the movement. So we're off and running. Now, those are literally the founders of critical race theory, according to every major source, and one of the founders calls them a group of Marxists. They call themselves Marxists. They don't have any problem with this. And just one quick little throwaway, because there's so many stupid rejections of critiques of critical race theory. They'll say, "Oh, well, that's just a legal theory." Well, the very next sentence, he says, At the outset, I had no idea that critical race theory would become a household word. And then he goes on to talk about how many citations, and skipping down to the last couple of sentences. Critical race theory has taken root in many disciplines outside of law. All right, critical race theory began as a critique of critical legal studies, saying that law was not nearly enough to deal with institutional racism. And then, because it was obviously critiquing the pathways of law, it then jumped into other disciplines as well, including, they mention here, the British CRT theorists are holding conferences talking about critical race theory in education. So it is in multiple disciplines. It's in cultural studies. It's in education studies. It's in pedagogy. It's in legal studies. It's all over the place. The tendrils of Marxism have infused so many different offshoot ideas, and they're just replications of Marxism. They're just taking the basic skeleton of Marxism and just reapplying all those concepts to different scenarios. So now, instead of thinking of it in terms of economics, we're thinking about it in terms of culture, in terms of race. With critical queer theory, thinking of it in terms of norms, and critical gender theory, thinking of it in terms of sexuality and sex and gender roles and feminism and that sort of a thing. Okay, now all of that said, how do we respond? All right, it's not enough to just simply explain what they believe. Well, actually, I take that back. Some ideas are so bad that you don't actually have to critique them. You just have to state them clearly, and the refutation takes hold all by itself. But that's not what we do here at Unsafe Media. Let's go ahead and let's talk about how can we think about this. So first off, realize that this is broadly a term for Marxism is structuralism. Okay, it is a structuralist theory, meaning that it's a theory that the structures of society are the primary, if not sometimes, depending on the theorist, it is the exclusive cause of the disparities and the way that the society has shaken out. So it's an entirely external locus of control. That's the way you see the world. Okay, so keep that in mind when we talk about trying to critique it. Okay, so the first thing we do is we go back to the chart, and we don't want to fall into the foolish idea that all of these are actually produced by white people. Rather, we need to recognize that the moral order is real, and the moral order is outside of society. And therefore, take each of those bullet points, and instead of accepting them as a part of white culture or rejecting them as a part of white culture, rather evaluate each one individually as either good or true or beautiful or conforming to the moral order or not. Some of them are bad. Some of the offshoots, some of the things that white culture has produced are not healthy. And we can critique that. That's totally fine. You don't have to be a raving Marxist lunatic in order to do just that. So we go back to it and we hold to what is good and true and beautiful, and we let go of the dross. Second thing is we need to reject all structuralist ideas about individuals. What I mean by that is this, is that we know that structures have an immense influence on the way that we develop, and therefore the way that we act and perceive and move throughout the world. But we need to reject the idea that it is the primary or exclusive driving factor in our behavior. Rather, we have to remember that we are made in the image of God. We have free will. We possess certain capacities and capabilities. To go to Uncle Aristotle, he says that we're rational animals. So we need to not exclusively think of ourselves as products of society, and rather think of ourselves as subjects, as humans, as autonomous beings within society, influenced by it, but also influencing it. In that vein, we need to develop a healthy stoicism. When I say that, a lot of people don't know much about stoicism. I highly recommend Ryan Holiday, The Daily Stoic. He does a great job of explaining this idea and the pragmatic philosophy that is born out of stoicism. But this idea that it's very similar to the serenity prayer, that we should know the things that we can change. We should have the courage to change them. We should know the things that we can't change, and we should have serenity in the midst of them. Next, we want to be unapologetic about holding to the things that we know are good and true and beautiful. When they say things like rationality and science are outgrowths of white culture, you should mock that mercilessly. The meme war must go on. We can never stop taking the meme ground, all right? We need to utterly destroy, through satire, through logical argumentation, through careful discussions with our friends and family, we need to destroy these, what I use this word too much, but these are insidious ideas. The idea that logic is a Western construct, right? The idea that that correct grammar is in some sense uniquely white, as though if you were to go to China and start speaking Mandarin, they wouldn't critique you for your terrible tones, all right? When you're speaking a language, you should speak it as best you possibly can. We give grace to those who are learning it for the first time, but we also, there's nothing wrong or white or oppressive about saying, hey, I don't understand what you're saying right now. Whatever the thing is on that list that they put on there, don't back down. Don't be shy. Don't feel timid. Now is the time for courage. And you should boldly feel confident in things like hard work. Boldly feel confident in things like the importance of being married and raising children. Next, if somebody says something is an outgrowth of white culture, don't go immediately into debunking mode. Tell them to prove it. Prove that that is not a common held virtue that has not just been produced, but has been discovered by many different cultures and many different races throughout human history. Almost every time they can't do that because most of these are just common sense, obvious ideas that are present in all different cultures. Let's say it is uniquely white. It is something that grew up out of white culture. Then you need to go beyond that and say, okay, now prove not only that it grew up out of white culture, but that it is oppressive to those who are not white. When someone says that we should decenter whiteness, or you hear something like that, or you see a social media post, demand that they explain what they mean by decentering. What does it mean to move it to the margins? Are you just saying that we need more black and brown people in positions of authority? And if so, why are we talking about decentering? Why not say it in clear, unambiguous terms? Is it because what you're wanting to say is unpalatable? Is it because it's unpopular? Is it because it's actually wrong? Is it because you're actually just a communist and you're trying to cover up for it? Next, make sure you have a healthy understanding of exactly what politics can and can't do. Very few, if any, people groups have elevated themselves out of poverty because they have people of their same skin color in positions of authority.
I can't think of a single group anywhere in the world that has risen from poverty to affluence through politics. There are any number of groups that have risen from poverty to affluence through almost every other conceivable means. When I look at the groups that have had spectacular rises, like the Jews or the Chinese, they are almost invariably groups that stayed away from politics. And they usually stayed away until after they became affluent. Some of them could then afford to go into politics. But that was not the mechanism by which they got where they are.
What was the mechanism?
Basically work, skills, saving.
Now, you're saying then that the train of the black community, in terms of voter registration and political power, political empowerment, is on the wrong track.
I think that if what you expect out of that is economic advancement for the mass of black people, now if all that you're looking for is some advancement on the part of the leaders, or if what you're looking for is something like what happened in the Civil Rights Revolution, where you needed to get the Southern Jim Crow system broken, that was an enormous achievement through politics, as I point out in the book. So it's not that politics can't do anything. It's a question that politics, like everything else, has some things it can do and some things it can't do. And from what I've seen of groups around the world economically, one of the things it seems not to be able to do is raise groups from poverty to affluence.
That doesn't mean that you shouldn't fight for genuine, fantastic, good social programs or government programs or public policies. We shouldn't give in to extreme libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism because they have their pitfalls too. But recognize that just because we have to do some things through governmental policy, don't assume that therefore you can fix all things through governmental policy. These next two, and we're wrapping up here, go hand in hand. Don't become a reactionary. Don't become a
mean, mad white man.
Don't adopt a white racial identity to go along with fighting against the woke brigade. Rather, continuously think of yourself as made in the image of God. Think of yourself as a rational animal, as that which possesses a soul, which can perceive and think and respond and react. You have free will. You have a God who made you, who put the moral order over you. Give into and yield to the beatific vision so that you may therefore pursue and imbibe and, to borrow their term, internalize the virtues. That's it for now. We've gone way over time, so we'll move on. This is Unsafe Media. It's all listener supported, so jump down to the link tree below. Consider Venmo and PayPal and liking and sharing and subscribing and notificationing and bell list and all that sort of stuff. I'm Ryan Martin, reminding you to trust God and keep your powder dry.